Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, we have a compelling and timely show today as award-winning author, social entrepreneur, and co-founder of Bioneers, Nina Simons, joins us today to share deep insights from her new book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their continuing presence, legacy, stewardship, and profound connection to this area. Our show comes to you from the ancestral lands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. And we encourage listeners to actively engage, align with, and support the many Native nations of Turtle Island, wherever you live and beyond. Leadership. What does it mean to lead in our times? Perhaps our times are requesting that we all express leadership in our own unique ways and forms. Etymology of the word leadership reveals root words that mean to go and also to guide. We might perceive of leadership as going somewhere together with others, with being the important preposition, because many of us have become jaded by modern leadership influenced by patriarchy, tyranny, hierarchy, and racial, social, or gender inequalities. Ours is a time that yearns for a new, feminine, inflected, and heart-led vision of leadership. Where might it lead us collectively at the local and global level? Many Indigenous peoples around the world hold understandings and perceptions about leadership that are inherently more spiritual, circular, communal, and collaborative than what many of us have experienced or been taught in traditional schools or by society at large. May we redefine and expand our notions of leadership, for much is at stake for the natural world, especially including ourselves. Some Indigenous communities speak of the bird of humanity that has been flying too long with one wing. Now is the time to return to balance and fly with two wings for the benefit of the world. Nina Simons is here to explore the potentiality of leadership for our shared future. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you, Carrie. That was a great intro. Thanks.
A humble thank you to you for your passionate and long-standing commitment to nature, to restoration of humanity and the earth, particularly through Bioneers and your leadership development trainings and retreats for women. I want to share one little passage from your book. It's just one little short paragraph, but I think it kind of sums up where we're headed in our interview today. I now believe that there's nothing that will serve our future better than bringing the aligned capacity of each of us, our own full spectrum diversity, to our leadership in all its forms. It seems to me the most potent and useful response in this moment when the world is asking so much of us.
I still believe.
You still believe it? Good. Do you count your original calling to serve and work for nature?
Well, sure. I mean, I've realized in retrospect, as I reflect from now, that even as a child growing up in New York City, I went to nature when I needed solace and when I sought balance and comfort. And that impulse was really rekindled much later in my late 20s when I experienced a biodiversity garden in southern New Mexico that was being tended by a master gardener for the purposes of preserving and spreading the biodiversity of food plants back into circulation because of the threat of monoculture, because of corporate concentration of the food system. And when I walked through that garden, completely not expecting it, I had this amazing, transformative, sensual, spiritual experience, which was that I saw a garden that was more beautiful than anything I had ever imagined. And it was hundreds and hundreds of really diverse plants, many of which I'd never heard of at the time, growing in very close proximity. And they were every color and size and shape. And there were pollinators buzzing all over. And it was incredibly fertile. And the master gardener who was tending it would introduce us to each plant as we walked through the garden. And he
Mhm.
introduced us by the Latin name and the common name. And then he explained how it was related to all the plants around it. And I
Mhm.
realized that this man knew these plants better than many people know their own families.
Right.
And right. And then he invited us to taste. And I was tasting herbs I'd never heard of before, like lemon licorice mint and chocolate basil, right?
Right.
And my senses were just dancing. And
Mhm.
then he explained why he was doing all this, and
Mhm.
that there was this immense threat to the
Mhm.
future of life itself, the
Mhm.
diversity of food plants that sustain us on this planet. And by the time I walked out of the garden, I felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're working for me now." So
Mhm.
that was my first introduction to really going into service and sacred activism on behalf of the natural world.
Mhm. How soon after that was Bioneers founded? Was it soon after
Um,
that
it
moment?
was about a year or two later when my
Mhm.
husband was researching to learn about not only who was doing something about biodiversity and the impending threat then of climate change. This
Right.
was back in like 89, right?
Right.
When James Lovelock had just sounded the alarm, not James Lovelock,
We,
oh,
we know what you're talking about. We
yeah,
know that
thank you.
moment.
The first global alarm about
Right.
climate change was out, and we responded to it by starting Bioneers. And it was really a response to discovering that there were amazing people out there doing brilliant, innovative solutions that were inspired by nature to heal nature, and that no one knew about them. And some of the inspiration from that also came from Indigenous peoples. We are based in the Southwest, and so we knew that Indigenous peoples are the first pioneers.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, even with our very first conference, there was always indigeneity and Indigenous worldviews really informing it at its heart. So,
Mhm.
it was this bringing together of, like, at the time, kind of way ahead of their time visionaries that
Mhm.
no one had ever heard of.
Right.
And we realized that the mainstream media really rarely covers what
Mhm.
the world that's being born. They mostly focus on if it bleeds, it leads,
Right.
you know,
Mm.
and when we had that first gathering, we began to realize that something very powerful was happening. And it has continued and evolved continuously for 34 years since.
Yeah, it's kind of like being a bit ahead of your times, and now the times have kind of caught up in a sense.
Exactly. It feels very much that way. Yes.
So the film Burning Times, want to pivot to your new book. The film Burning Times was a pivotal moment for you in your understanding of leadership. I was wondering if you could share a bit of the history for our listeners so they understand this trajectory in leadership, particularly with regard to suppression of the feminine.
Sure. Okay, let's see. The Burning Times is a film that any listener can find online if you Google it. It was made in 1990, I believe, in Canada, and it's
Mhm.
about an hour long, and it tells the story of the 300 to 400 year period in European history, which had correlatives all over the world,
Mhm.
where women who were healers and mystics and doulas and death doulas were systematically persecuted and tortured and burned for the supposed crime of being witches.
Mhm.
And when I saw this film, it's rather dated by now, but the
Right.
factual basis of it is very solid.
Mhm.
And depending which historian you believe, somewhere between 50,000 and several million women over the
Mhm.
course of 7 generations
Mhm.
were systematically, right, hunted and persecuted and tortured and killed.
Mhm.
And when I saw it, several things happened for me. One was that it was the first time that I understood in my bones why I might have a fear of speaking my truth in public.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and as I've learned, well, let me say that later. The second thing that happened was I was flabbergasted because I thought, this is a gigantic event in human history that
Right.
has had repercussions all over the world. How
Mhm.
can I not have learned about this in school?
Sure.
And so I began to research. And
Mhm.
what I found was that every aspect of human civilization basically
Mhm.
underwent a shift from the
Mhm.
purview of the feminine to the purview of the masculine over the course of those 300 to 400 years.
Mhm.
And what that meant for me was that I began to understand that all of the challenges that we face as a species that I'd been learning about through Bioneers
Mhm.
or could be seen as products of the imbalance of the masculine and the feminine, not just in our embodied forms, but in their archetypal forms. You
Mhm.
know, if you think about the yin yang
Mhm.
of ancient traditional wisdom that says we are meant to live in balance,
Right.
that I saw that imbalance really vividly
Mhm.
because it was so clear institutionally, as well as culturally, as well as physically in
Right.
my lived experience.
Mhm.
And of course, since then, science has proven that epigenetic trauma is a thing
Mhm.
and that we all carry the trauma of our ancestors and of our histories in our
Mhm.
DNA,
Mhm.
which has led me to believe, Carrie, that we all carry that internal implicit bias
Mhm.
toward the masculine and away from the feminine
Right.
within ourselves, which is helps me understand why patriarchy has been so intractable all
Mhm.
over the world.
Mhm.
And so then I embarked on an exploration of leadership. I started being acknowledged for my leadership. And I
Mhm.
realized that as I unpacked it and worked with hundreds of women leaders,
Right.
I saw that we all arrived to this deep dive immersion training that we co-created,
Right.
believing that we weren't leaders and that
Mm.
that was not a title we could aspire to or claim or feel good about. And
Mhm.
as we unpacked that, we found that we all had mental models of what leadership is and does that
Mhm.
none of us wanted.
Yeah. With
And,
all negative connotations, right?
right. Well, who wants to be involved in power over and brutalizing and, hierarchical systems that devalue other people rather
Mhm.
than lifting them up? And
Right.
especially if you happen to be in a female body, I
Mhm.
do think it's part of our conditioning to want to be more communally oriented and more partnership
Nurturing.
oriented.
Yeah.
So, it's a long answer, but I hope that begins to unpack your question.
I think it's important too to just hear that notion of how long that history was. I think people kind of have like a vague overview, but they probably most do not know really how impactful that was. And for
Right.
example, how you said that from that moment on, women were really not practicing medicine, it was the men. So that's a big shift in, herbal tradition, in folk wisdom, and in the ways we heal ourselves. So, I mean, as you say, it really impacted so many different arenas of our lives today. So it is one of the original PTSD syndromes for all of us, no matter your gender.
I
But
think so. And no matter your ethnic identity,
mhm.
it's global. And that's really surprising, but true, I think.
Yeah, because you spoke about some of the initial reluctance you had to being called a leader for these reasons. Part of it is going back to that, like you said, maybe it doesn't feel safe to speak out as a woman or to stand up, in like a poppy in the field. So when did you actually shift from having maybe some kind of a reluctance to really feeling empowered by being a leader? Not from the title, but just that you had the capacity to lead and it was not something you were shrinking back from.
I think it happened over time. I think, like many of us do, in order to cultivate myself, I developed a training where I could learn along with other women. And in many ways, one of the biggest ahas for me coming through that time was the recognition that no wonder the patriarchy has invested so heavily in a cat fight scenario for women.
Right. Hmm.
Because when we actually align with each other
Yeah.
and can have each other's backs,
Hmm.
we have the capacity to strengthen each other quickly and solidly and enduringly. And
Yeah.
I think it's a tremendous social capacity for all of us. And it's important to me to say, Carrie, that over time, although I've done a lot of work with women, I've really come to believe that all of us are as badly wounded by this imbalance,
Mhm,
regardless of what gender we might be at this moment,
mhm.
that men are hurt as badly by patriarchy as women are,
Sure.
if not worse. And so, what I came to feel over time was that my growing into my own acceptance and engagement with leadership
Mhm,
involved what I call full spectrum leadership, which
mhm,
means that in our mental model, we think leadership is all about aggression and strategy, leading from the mind, and
mm,
and action
mhm.
and brute force,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
But in
Dominion. Mhm,
fact, the leaders I most admire and most aspire to be like are
mhm,
those that are leading from their hearts, from their spirits, from their body's wisdom.
mhm.
And so for me, full spectrum leadership came to mean not only being able to draw from anywhere on my feminine to masculine quote, human characteristics,
Right.
but also being able to integrate all the wisdoms of this animal,
Mm,
this instrument that I am in this life on earth, in
mhm,
order to meet this time that, as you quoted me, asks so much of us.
mhm. What would you say that this time, I mean, you say that a lot in the book, and I'm wondering what would you say that this time is asking of us?
I would say that it is asking of us to adapt to a time of serial and turbulent change,
Mhm,
which we are not necessarily very psychologically or emotionally or social sciences trained to be ready for.
mm,
And to um, and in order to adapt to a time of so much change,
right.
I think we have to shift some very core biases within ourselves,
Mhm,
like diversity being scary or a threat,
mhm, mhm,
right? Like the rapidly shifting demographics of our country,
mhm.
and really facing into the fact that what we've inherited is a culture of white supremacy that we
Right.
have to actively engage with to undo,
Mhm,
and really partner with those who have learned the most about resilience because of how they've been traumatized, serially traumatized by
mhm.
our history and our culture and our systems, which are all crumbling, as we know, and falling apart in big chunks.
Right. Well, I think it also, what you're saying also harkens back to that same rupture that you're talking about, that European history, or that was actually kind of a global history or subjugation of the feminine, and going back to indigenous forms of leadership. I mean, at that time, we were living in a more pagan,
Yes.
animistic way. And so that we were living from an earth-centered way, earth-centered perspective that was natural. And that was what got subjugated during that time and kind of just remained such until now. And now we're in this moment of kind of upheaval and writing that and redirecting ourselves back to what were our origins, our indigenous origins.
Well, and I think exactly what you're pointing to, Carrie, is really a fundamental shift in our worldview. I mean, I think that's what this time and Gaia is asking of us. Because if we look back to indigenous roots, which we are all indigenous to Mother Life,
Right.
I'll go on after our break.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and then we'll be right back, listeners, to speak more with Nina Simons.